What's up, everyone? This is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the VO2 Max podcast. Today's episode is a good one. I got to sit down with David Tilbury-Davis, who has been a coach to both professional and amateur athletes since 1995. He's been around a while and he has a wealth of knowledge, and today I got to sit down with him and pick his brain a little bit, which I was excited about. More specifically, I was excited because he is the coach to Lionel Sanders, who's one of my favorite triathletes of all time. So I was super excited to be able to sit down with Lionel's coach and be able to, just pick his brain and talk to him about this wealth of knowledge that he has. David has worked with Olympic athletes, Commonwealth Games athletes, professional athletes, amateur athletes, and he's worked with those athletes across a range of different endurance sports, including triathlon, cycling, and mountain biking. Most people might probably recognize him as being a triathlon coach because Lionel Sanders especially has become more and more public with kind of posting videos on his YouTube channel and so on and so forth. And so that's actually how I had heard of David, was through Lionel Sanders' YouTube series, and he mentioned David as being his coach. And then that's when I went ahead and looked up David and then got in touch with him to be on a podcast episode. So I was super excited to be able to sit down with him and again, just talk to him about this wealth of knowledge that he's developed over the past 25 years of being a coach with elite level amateur athletes and elite level professional athletes across a range of different sports. In this particular episode, though, we talked about some factors that he's kind of noticed over the years have been associated with better long distance triathlon performance. So we kind of talk a little bit about like what the research says as far as what factors kind of contribute to better long distance triathlon performance, and then what he's also noticed over the years through his experience, some factors that are associated with better long distance triathlon performance as well. So yeah, it was a super interesting podcast episode. We talked about a lot of different things that are associated with improved triathlon performance. And there's a lot here for both the amateur triathlete as well as maybe the elite level or professional triathlete to take away from this, as well as for the coaches out there too. We talk a lot about just kind of the art of coaching and what he's learned over the past 25 years through his coaching experience and working with all these different elite level athletes. So there's a lot here for both the athlete and the coach as well. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode and the conversation that I had with David Tilbury-Davis.
Morning, Ryan.
Hey, how's it going? I forgot I was about to say good morning to you, but it's evening over there for you. So
5 p.m. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So not quite as late as I thought.
No, not quite.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate you taking the time to sit down and chat with me.
That's all right. That's right.
Yeah. How have things been going for you throughout COVID and all that?
Fairly sort of typical work schedule. Obviously I'm not traveling as much to work face to face with the clients. So, I was in Kona in February with Lionel. I was in the wind tunnel in the UK with Kim Morrison in March, and then that sort of all stopped. But since then it's predominantly been sort of remote coaching, and been going okay. Most folks kind of happy to just sort of crack on and get better, and some folks have had the opportunity to race, and some folks are pivoting into different things. Kim Morrison had a go at the National Time Trial Championships at the 10, the 25, the 50, and the 100, and she got 2 podiums and a fourth. So got 2/3 and a fourth. Lionel's taking a crack at the Canadian hour record.
Yeah.
A few other people have raced. Alyssa Daler raced at Huntington Olympic Tri the other weekend past. So yeah, it's for those that absolutely clearly know they're not racing till next year, they're happy just to crack on, and then there's others that have just had some opportunity to do something, or they may soon also have the opportunity to race.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, and it's cool to see some of the pros too, especially like Lionel and Kim Morrison, like you mentioned, just going after different things that they're not. They obviously wouldn't do those kinds of things if they were, building up for Kona like Lionel would or something like that. So
Yeah.
kind of cool to see him doing something a little unique. So yeah, when does Lionel go after the hour record? I know I'm following like his YouTube video series on that, but
I mean, at some point, I think this month. Just it depends on Cycling Canada and getting access to the velodrome, but likely in the next couple of weeks.
yeah, how big of a factor is, because he's never ridden a track bike before, right? He has to learn how to like ride in the velodrome on the line and the track bike.
Yeah, he's been doing that. He has a track bike that he's using. So he's done that a few times now. He'll be back in the velodrome on Friday this week, so tomorrow. That'll be the 9th of October. Do some more testing.
Yeah.
So no, he's familiarized himself pretty reasonably with it. Obviously, his ability to hold the black line is, it's not nationally going to be as good as, say, Ganna or Ashton Lambie or somebody like that. It's been their profession.
Yeah, cool. And he's aiming for what I think like 400 watts was his goal power output.
I mean, the speed is, he's going for the Canadian record, which is a little low. That's the key thing. We're shooting for achieving more than the Canadian hour record, which is a little over 48k an hour.
Yeah, that's crazy. But cool. Yeah, I'm excited to see him go after it. So I'm assuming there'll be some kind of video he makes about his attempt. So I'll be excited to watch it. To get us started, just give listeners a little bit of an idea about who you are, what your background is, and your coaching that you're doing right now.
Sure. My name is David Tilbury-Davis. I'm a triathlon coach. Been coaching since 1995, so a very long time. And in that period of time, I've worked across different sports: triathlon, cycling, mountain biking, and I've worked with athletes from sort of Olympic, Commonwealth Games, professional long distance athletes, competitive amateurs, national junior athletes, athletes in the sort of older age categories, in the sort of 65 plus categories. So I've got a sort of broad field of experience. Mm-hmm. And I've always worked with a small number of athletes globally. I don't run a coaching business. I don't have any assistant coaches. It's just sort of myself working with sort of 15, 16 athletes globally each year.
Yeah, awesome. And yeah, just kind of a funny side note, when I was looking at how long you'd been coaching, I realized that it's almost as long as I'd been alive. I was born in 93, so I was like, wow, this guy's been coaching almost as many years as I've been around. So definitely.
Well, that makes me feel old, but I don't feel as old as I am. Maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, no, that's a good thing. In no way to age you there. Just I thought it was funny.
That's all good.
But yeah, and then you've obviously worked with a lot of elite level and professional triathletes, long distance triathletes, which is what the podcast is mainly going to focus on today, is triathlon. So that's kind of what I wanted to pick your brain about a little bit, just because I'm a big research guy. I like to look at the research, dissect it, and then kind of share it with other athletes and coaches. And when you kind of dive into the research, especially with endurance athletes, you'll notice that 3 of the biggest physiological factors that are associated with better performance tend to be VO2 max, anaerobic or lactate threshold, and then movement economy. If those 3 factors are going up in an athlete, then likely their performance is going to go up. But there's obviously, that doesn't tell the whole story, right? An endurance athlete isn't just a product of VO2 max.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first of all, you have to take a step back, though, and contextualize research. I think for a long time, sports science has evolved over the last 25 years. And, there was a point, I would probably say sort of 10 years ago that it became, very trendy to talk about being very evidence-based.
Hmm.
And I don't mean that necessarily in a disingenuous way, because I was probably guilty of that as well. But the reality is that with elite athletes, you're dealing with the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. And so actually most of these studies are just not done necessarily with comparative subjects. There are some studies that have been done with Olympic athletes and multiple world champions. There's quite a lot out of Stephen Seeler's lab, Professor Stephen Seeler, and a few other of the research scientists that he's worked with. But predominantly, a lot of the findings that you see are drawn from a sort of reasonably athletic population in an academic environment, and there are certainly corollaries, but they're not always going to tell the whole story. So I think nowadays what you find with coaches such as myself is a view that it's useful to be sort of evidence led, but actually to contextualize that with real world practicalities and experience and context. So certainly VO2 max is an interesting one as an example, because yes, you might suggest that to be successful at an elite level you have to have a high VO2 max, but almost immediately somebody is going to name Frank Shorter, who was an Olympic marathon runner with not a very high VO2 max, but whose sort of threshold was an extremely high percentage of VO2 max for various physiological reasons. So, the three things that you named are certainly relevant. I wouldn't necessarily prioritize them as the biggest. And then I think you also get into the whole movement economy one. And that's an interesting one, because then you have to start to define that. So I kind of put that back to you and say, for the benefit of the listeners, how would you define movement economy?
So I know it's defined a few different ways in the literature, and if you ask different coaches, they might define it different ways as well. But normally how I like to think of economy and how I'll explain it to athletes is it's essentially how efficient you are at getting from point A to point B. So the least amount of oxygen and also like calories you can utilize to complete a given task, right?
Yeah, so you're talking efficiency, you're not talking movement.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, because obviously movement, and the reason I asked that is movement would be very biomechanically driven, and on that basis you simply can't you can't break the laws of physics. And what I mean by that is that if somebody naturally has a stride where they overstride past the sort of their center of mass, then basic physics would dictate they generate a lot of braking force. So that would be very poor sort of movement economy, but that has nothing to do with efficiency. So I think the efficiency definitely an important factor, because I've worked with athletes that you probably could look at their running mechanics and say, those running mechanics, aren't great in a basic physics context. But I know for a fact, because they've been in the lab, that their efficiency is off the charts. And so there's compensation in different areas that allow them to maximize their potential.
Right. Would Lionel, not to bring Lionel up necessarily, but would he be an example, Lionel Sanders, would he be an example of someone who maybe doesn't necessarily have like the prettiest movement economy, but he tends to be really efficient with the gait and the biomechanics he does have while running?
I think Lionel's an interesting one. If you look at some of the more recent videos, I say recent, I mean in the last sort of week or two, of his running, he's looking, probably the best he's ever looked. And there's reasons for that from a training perspective. But I wouldn't say that his sort of asymmetry in his gait is necessarily particularly inefficient, because when you look at him running, there's not a huge stride length. There's not a lot of there's little to no overstriding. So I think he is actually, quite efficient, but there's asymmetry in his gait, in the same way that, there was asymmetry in, Haile Gebrselassie running gait, because he grew up running to school carrying books under one arm, and Paula Radcliffe with her head movement. So I think he's an interesting example where looks can be deceiving, and it's ironic, because there's a study that came out. I don't know whether you've looked at it. There's a study that came out a couple of weeks ago that was looking at the actual ability of highly experienced coaches to judge the efficiency, and I'm choosing my words carefully, the efficiency of athletes based on their running video footage. And without fail, it showed that the capacity to predict efficiency was terrible. So that's the kind of Pandora's box that you open when you look at that sort of movement versus efficiency. Is it, do the two work hand in hand? Do they oppose each other?
Right. Yeah. No, and I hadn't looked at that study. That's interesting. And yeah, I guess efficiency is really something that you have to kind of measure in a laboratory. It would be obviously very difficult to just look at someone, and kind of what you're getting at is you can't just necessarily look at someone's biomechanics, and just because maybe it doesn't look aesthetically beautiful like you would want it to, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not incredibly efficient with the biomechanics they do have.
Yes. So. Yeah, and that's that's the interesting thing, is that there's a great athletics coach that used the phrase that that I learned from him, which is this: you can't cue anatomical dysfunction. And so when you're coaching the run or the swim, if you have somebody that is limited in their range of movement, or their posture is such that certain attributes that you want to happen in the water or running are physically impossible for them, then there's no sense in trying to drum into somebody something that they just can't do. Like a classic would be if you have an age group triathlete who is very limited in their shoulder and scapular mobility, and you're constantly trying to get them to do chicken wing drill with a high elbow to ingrain a high elbow recovery. I guarantee that in sort of 90% of the cases that's occurring, you're actually making their stroke worse, because you're messing with their rotation and timing in a way that isn't beneficial to the swim stroke.
Right. So it's almost about just maximizing how efficient someone is with the biomechanics and range of motion, flexibility, and mobility that they do have.
Yes.
Essentially.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I know, and just because Lionel's so public with sharing everything, he's been a really interesting one to watch as well, because he has like some asymmetries, like you mentioned, but his biomechanics aren't necessarily terrible.
No.
And it's been interesting to just kind of watch how he's approached improving his run efficiency and some of the things that he's kind of noticed throughout the years. It's been really interesting to kind of follow his journey in that regard. So,
and this, and that point of looks can be deceiving is a good one. There's a great video, available on the internet of a breakdown of Josh Amberger's swim stroke, and we all know that Josh is an incredibly fast swimmer. But when you see the footage, his swimming, it's not pretty, but it's highly efficient.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what you tend to find in a lot of elite athletes is, they are sort of elite for certain reasons. And so, certainly the three things that you refer to, kind of going back to your point of, what are the sort of specific factors that probably are most associated with success.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't necessarily say VO2 max or lactate threshold. I would certainly say Um, Efficiency, both physiological and biomechanical, are pretty important factors. Um, but then I'd also say that their threshold being as a percentage of their VO2 max being very high would be an important factor.
Mm-hmm.
And then sticking with sort of physiology, then also sort of their sort of underlying metabolism. Um, and what I mean by that is, how are they using lactate? How do they generate lactate? How do they use it as a fuel? What's their sort of fueling economy like? And you can, in this day and age, you can get a good understanding of, how much fat and carbohydrate does somebody use, utilizing sort of lactate testing.
Mm-hmm.
You don't necessarily need to have a $25,000 Met cart to do that. Um, and that's a hugely important factor. And in fact, at the elite level, I think the athletes that are really truly successful have really nailed that, because the intensity that these men and women are operating at, invariably they could be in a situation where their actual race pace um, far outstrips their capacity to fuel it. And so what I mean by that is, you could have an athlete, an elite athlete, male, that races in an Ironman at 280 watts. And at 280 watts, their underlying metabolism may be that it's costing them, 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour. Now that's impossible to fuel.
Right.
So the question is not how do you make this person fitter. The question is, how do you make this person more efficient?
Mm. Right.
Um, so I think probably efficiency is the biggest driver, whether it's sort of metabolic, oxygen, or biomechanical. I think those are probably the biggest factors. And then, the last piece of the puzzle is the psychology. You just can't ignore that in the pursuit of success. You need to understand. I think any athlete, age group or pro, you want to really truly understand what are your core values um, in life and in sport, because invariably the ones in life sort of get reflected in sport, and those are the things that drive you.
Yeah.
Um, and and those are the things that your sort of beliefs are sort of wrapped up in. And as a coach, once I have a good understanding of that, um, positive or negative, because for some people they can be very grounded in negative experiences in their past life,
Mm-hmm.
that can actually help me, help the athlete achieve more success by understanding their sort of behavior patterns and psychology, rather than saying, this is a training program that you must do that produces champions. It just doesn't work that way.
Mm. Yeah. And the psychology piece is interesting too. And I was actually just listening to it was some webinar that I think World Triathlon Series Edmonton had put on. They brought in Steven Seiler and then
Hmm.
one other researcher, and I can't remember his name. He was Irish, but he was talking about the placebo effect. Like there's been research studies that have been done where they do like sham knee surgeries and compare that to like the normal knee surgery. And so participants undergoing the surgery don't know if they're getting like the sham or not. And those who get the sham surgery end up doing just as well or almost as good as the people who get the actual surgery. And basically what he was getting at was the psychology piece of just believing in what they're doing, believing in the coach, believing that what they're doing is the best thing for them. And it's a huge component of just the overall training plan. And is that kind of what you're starting to tap into a little bit when you mentioned the psychology piece, just all those different factors of getting an athlete to buy in and believe? And
Yeah, I mean, buying is hugely important as a coach. People need to be emotionally invested in the process, whatever those drivers are. Um, otherwise, it's not good for athlete or coach. It's not a healthy environment.
Mhm.
But you know, the sort of getting into sort of a deeper level of, um, that point you make about sort of placebo and the implications of that, from a belief perspective, um, is, I think, is less relevant in Ironman. It's certainly in long distance racing, because the nature of long distance racing is that there is inevitably going to be a point in the race where, psychologically speaking, the athlete will reach a low point, and that may be nutritionally driven, it may be neurologically driven, it may be psychologically driven. But there are some coaches, and sort of sports scientists, that talk about the idea of flow and getting into a flow state. And I'm just not convinced by any evidence out there that an athlete can be in a flow state
Mm.
for 8 hours straight. It's
Right.
just cognitively, it's way too demanding.
Right.
Now, could they access some of the sort of mental toolkits that are available, um, to to try and turn on that flow state at certain points in the race? Yeah, absolutely. But I don't believe it's something that, um, can be achieved for like a 7 hours straight, or 8 hours straight, or 9 hours straight, or 10 hours straight. And that's why I go back to, I think it's hugely important for an athlete to really understand their core values and beliefs, because when you're at the bottom of the energy lab and you feel like you're completely blown, and you can see your main rival 400 meters up the road ahead of you, you need to know why you need to go to a very dark place.
Mm.
And if you don't, it makes it a lot harder.
Yeah. No, that's interesting, and that's I like the discussion we kind of get into with this, because I've always known that psychology is obviously hugely important, especially when you start getting into the longer distance endurance events. And so it's interesting to kind of hear your perspective and what you've garnered over the years on this, because I had never necessarily thought about approaching psychology in that way, getting at like their core values and beliefs and trying to like use that almost to their advantage, so that when they are
Yeah.
like really deep in the well, they can get the most out of themselves.
Yeah, I mean, you can't get away from the need for appropriate physiological training.
Mm-hmm.
But then I think, likewise, if we go completely the other way, and we say, what are some of the pitfalls that athletes or coaches should avoid? I would say, try to avoid getting wrapped up in an obsession over raising FTP, as an example, because the reality is that any half decent coach knows, you can write a training program to you know drive up somebody's FTP over 12 weeks, and if you're using a 20-minute test as a, I'm choosing my words carefully, litmus test of that FTP,
Mm-hmm.
um, you could make somebody incredibly good at 20-minute tests, over 12 weeks, and give yourself a pat on the back and say, oh great, they're aerobically, they're so much fitter, they're so much stronger. But the reality is if their longest bike ride is 90 minutes, and at the end of that 12 weeks they're racing an Ironman, they're going to suck in that race.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
um, so I think, I mean, I'm being maybe a touch facile there, but I think every piece plays a part. um, and certainly at the elite level, there's definitely a need to have really good foundations in terms of the physiological basis of training, the really good foundations in terms of nurturing the right psychology and behavioral practices, and a really good foundation in terms of recovery strategies and fueling strategies and nutrition, and all of those things, and all of those are predicated on understanding at various levels, whether it's just, at the surface or extremely deeply.
Hmm. Yeah. And so the way I kind of am imagining everything as you're talking about it is it's almost like, and obviously the puzzle looks different depending on what kind of athlete you are, but like with long distance, especially like elite level triathletes, it's basically like a puzzle. And the kind of the big puzzle pieces that I'm hearing you mention are like lactate threshold is one, and then efficiency is another huge one. And then more specifically with lactate threshold, it's like the percentage of their VO2 max where their lactate threshold lies. Like the higher that is, the better. And then the psychology piece is obviously hugely important. And then you have all these other little kind of pieces floating around there as well, because as we know, long distance triathlon is a massive puzzle with many different moving pieces. But I'm curious with
Yeah,
all these.
yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, in this day and age, you can weigh a bike, you can weigh a person, you can, you can analyze somebody in a wind tunnel, you can get a CDA value, you can plug that into a model, an algorithmic model of a particular course, and you can say, right, what do we need to produce power wise for you to ride a competitive bike split?
Mhm.
And we get an answer back, we get a power number, and then we can reference that power number against their sort of metabolic efficiency, or we can reference it against their existing sort of threshold, and say, okay, actually, is that target an unrealistic percentage of your threshold? Yes, no. If the answer is yes, clearly we need to get you fitter.
Mhm.
um, is it an unrealistic percentage um, of your ability to fuel that power output? Okay, we need to improve your underlying metabolic efficiency. Is it actually a situation where your CDA, your drag value is really not that competitive, and in fact you could hit those numbers, but you just simply wouldn't actually go the speed that we require for the course. And so then it's like, okay, right, back to the drawing board. Are there equipment choices that we can change and we can test? Do we need to work on your mobility and your stability? Are you unstable on the bike, pelvic, in your pelvic region? Are you limited in your flexibility such that you can't hold a good position? Do we need to change your bike because it's the wrong size? These some of these things on face value seem like really, you know, simple answers, like, oh, in Kona, to be competitive, you need to ride this time. It's like, okay, great. Well, I think the mistake that a lot of professional athletes make nowadays is they still, not so much now, not so much now. I think more and more people are, exploring all corners of performance, but, there's still a percentage of athletes that show up on race day and have a sort of feeling of, well, magical unicorn pixie dust is going to be sprinkled on my ability because I've rested a bit before the race, and I'm going to have a performance that's going to be a shining performance of my career that I've never really evidenced the ability to do in training, or I've never practically assessed the capacity to do in terms of my drag or my nutrition or my capacity.
Yeah.
And I'd say even for age group athletes, how do you wrap all of this up? I would say that, for any elite or high performing age group, or even just your, beginning amateur, is, not to be cliche, but, know yourself,
Mhm.
know your body, know your ability, know your expectations, know your beliefs. And that's going to put you, ahead of probably 50% of the competition.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's a great way to put it and good perspective to have, especially for those beginning and just starting out where they kind of get really caught up in all the, fancy terms and numbers and tests that we have nowadays to measure certain things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I like
I
that.
mean, I mean, there's many other coaches out there that might label me a sort of a data coach. And, even to go as far as say, oh, you kind of, sort of, you put your sort of stake in the ground under the sort of, if you aren't measuring it, you aren't managing it. And I kind of agree with that to a point, but I would say ultimately, in the day, if you have individuals who don't have a highly calibrated um, mind and body from 20 plus years of doing a sport, then your average amateur athlete, should, you know, embrace with open arms the ability to use certain devices, budget capacities, to simply do one thing, and that is to, inform the supercomputer that sits between the ears.
Right.
A power meter, a heart rate monitor, even a stopwatch, or a speedometer, all those things are simply tools by which you learn. And in learning, you obtain the capacity to make better decisions.
Right. Yeah.
And that's an important distinction. I think there are a lot of athletes that go, I've got a power meter, my FTP is 200 watts, I have to ride at 150 watts in an Ironman, I'm just going to stare at the computer and ride at 150 watts. And, there might be a huge headwind. It might be incredibly hot and humid, and they sort of ignore that, and, they obsess over that one detail. And my point is, don't obsess over that. Listen to your body, listen to your perception of, pay attention to your perception of effort. I was talking to a coach the other day that said, when they were younger and they used to swim competitively with a swim coach, they would actually sometimes do a workout where they do like sort of 10 by 100, and the coach would, cover the pace clock, and he'd run a stopwatch and he'd send everybody off. And then he'd say it, then he said, okay, well, what did I said to you to swim aerobically, what did you swim? Take a guess. And they keep doing this, and as they got more experience, they got better and better at self-calibrating. And that's kind of the point with toys, is get better and better at self-calibrating. And likewise, when you see professional athletes that are that have been in the sport a long time, or come from a single sport, and they poo-poo the use of devices, then I can understand that misinterpretation. Because if you've spent 20 years of your athletic life riding a bike, and the latter years riding a bike with a power meter on it, then you can probably roll out the front door with a bike on the bike with a friend, and that friend say ride at 200 watts, and you could do that plus or minus 5 watts purely by feel. Yeah. Because you have a highly calibrated sort of supercomputer between the ears. So it goes back to that point of know yourself. If you lack calibration, then sort of embrace ways of improving that.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's really similar. I had Jim Vance on the podcast a month or two ago, and your approach kind of reminded me of that conversation I had with him, because he's a pretty big device data driven kind of person. And he really likes to use the data, kind of like you mentioned, not to like have his athletes become slaves to the data, like they have to just stare at their watch or their computer the entire race. It's just to inform better decisions and learning, so that the athlete can become like more in tune and in touch with like their capabilities and what they can do and how they feel. And so it's definitely something that
and it can go both ways. I had a situation recently with an athlete that used a power meter generally, and they were sort of inspired, by the Tour de France to not use it. And they said, this next thing that I'm doing, I'm not going to use it. I'm going to go by feel. I'm going to just go by, my heart. And I was like, that's great. That's fantastic. I absolutely happily embrace you doing that. And because my expectation was, maybe something special might happen, and maybe there might be a learning opportunity there. And they raced, and they had a reasonably good performance. But at the end of it, they said, that the one thing that they learned was they actually needed, a sort of, a numerical cue
Hmm.
to hold them more accountable, because in hindsight they felt they just kind of didn't quite push hard enough.
Right.
And so that's what these things allow us, that's what these things allow us to sort of do or not do.
Yeah. Did they get that idea from Tadej Pogačar winning the time trial in 21, not using a power meter on the last little bit?
Yes. But then ironically, if you read the background and you talk to Inigo San Milan, you would understand that, he'd ridden that climb multiple times with a power meter and knew
Right.
exactly, what his time checks at certain points on that climb needed to be.
Yeah, there's a method to their madness at that level in today's day and age. They're not doing anything based on just guesswork. It's
No,
very
exactly.
calculated.
No, nobody's doing anything based on guesswork. There's always an underlying context.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah, it was interesting to kind of see Tadej Pogačar not use the power meter because like he used the data and training to inform the feeling and the perception and the time checks that he was
Absolutely.
trying to achieve on race day. So that's another very interesting
Absolutely.
example of kind of the feedback and the interplay between data and feel. So yeah, that was a good conversation, especially for a lot of kind of like you mentioned in the beginning, amateur athletes who might be getting into the sport, so that hopefully they can learn over time not to just become like a slave to the numbers or the data or what their GPS watch is telling them, but they can hopefully learn to kind of get used to that interplay between the data and their feeling and how the two kind of complement each other and what the data might be telling them and what the numbers are telling
Yeah.
them. So yeah. Just so we answered a lot of the questions that I had, but one I did have real quick that came up was, are there any, and you mentioned some of the things that you like to kind of assess and test, but are there certain variables that you like to assess or test in training to kind of keep track of how things are progressing?
Yeah, I mean, I work with Inside, which is a business that centers around understanding some of the lactate metabolism
Hmm.
of an athlete, and then how they actually utilize that lactate as fuel, and how that impacts on their sort of fat max, and then their use of carbohydrate. And I've worked with them for a few years, and that's something that I regularly utilize with athletes to understand ultimately how sort of metabolically efficient they are. um, I'll sort of conjoin that with some other tests that we might do in the swim, um, to look at how their form in the water is holding together, or their fitness. um, I think once athletes get very experienced, there isn't really a need to do too many, you know, FTP tests or critical power tests or VO2 max tests, because the reality is with these types of athletes, you can have a certain workout that you do that is extremely informative, or and so you might do that workout 3 or 4 times a quarter, and it would be very informative in terms of their progression and their mechanics, or their fitness.
Hmm.
And an example of that would be, say, in the swim, would be doing a main set where you do a couple of hundreds off an incredibly short turnaround, and they're all basically absolutely as fast as you can go. And I think if you do 5 to 6 of those with a 5-second recovery, you're very quickly going to get, as a coach, you're going to get a good understanding of where is somebody's fitness at, and actually how well are they holding their stroke together.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and I've seen kind of two camps with the approach of testing where some people like to do like periodic standardized tests and they like to do them often, and then others kind of like to use just like key workouts as a way of kind of gauging fitness, and then some kind of like to blend the two as well. And I kind of like to blend the two.
Yeah, I'm definitely a blender, because I also know that, you know, over my years of coaching, I've seen athletes, you know, I've seen incredibly talented athletes that literally, you know, please don't get me wrong, I'm not anti 20-minute bike tests. You know, they,
Mhm.
again, they have their place for certain individuals, or there's some context of use. But I've legitimately had really talented athletes who, if I gave them a 20-minute bike test to do, they simply could not do it in a manner that is reflective of their physiology. And yet I could give them like a ramp test, like a VO2 max ramp test to failure, and they would literally go until they vomit and fall off the bike.
Yeah.
And vice versa. I've seen people that just cannot do a ramp test in a way that is reflective of their peak capacity, and yet, you know, they can bury themselves in a 20-minute test. So and what that just reinforces is how huge a you know, a role psychology plays.
Right. Right. Yeah, I was going to say that kind of tells you a lot about the athlete as well, when you see that kind of discrepancy between, say, like certain tests or certain kind of key workouts that you might put in there to gauge their fitness. So that's kind of interesting. Yeah. All right. Well, one last question I had for you before we start to wrap things up was, and this is just kind of to summarize, I guess, everything that we were talking about. And it might be kind of a difficult question to answer as well, because I'm just asking you to kind of summarize everything that you know about long distance triathlon and put it into like maybe a sentence or two. But if we could like bridge the gap between your experience working with long distance triathletes and then the application of that experience, so someone else could kind of take what you've learned and maybe walk away with one or two key things. If you were to give one piece of advice to, let's just say, like an ambitious or a driven long distance triathlete, what would that one piece of advice be?
I mean, I can define it pretty reasonably. I would say, you know, step one, um, really carefully define your version of success.
Okay.
So that might be, you know, a race, a certain physical ability, a certain podium placing, qualifying for a pro card, crossing a finish line. But really carefully define your version of success in terms of what is demanded of you, and then really carefully, to the best of your ability, try to understand yourself as an athlete, um, and then, you know, try to do a gap analysis of the difference between the two.
Hmm.
And if you can do that gap analysis, you know, whether it's through, you know, using mentors or coaches or speaking to seasoned athletes, if you can do that gap analysis well, then that gives you the majority of what you need to base a process of development on.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that. That's cool. It's like a nice little 3-step process for athletes when they're thinking about what they want to achieve. Um, nice. That's a good way of distilling it all down into one thing. So
You put me on the spot.
yeah, no, that was really good. That was a really well thought out answer. All right. Well, that was good. I think there's a lot for both athletes and coaches who might be listening to this to take away. And it was definitely fun for me to kind of pick your brain. I'm a big fan of you. And obviously Lionel Sanders is one of my favorite triathletes, as I've told you, to just kind of watch and follow and see his journey. So pretty cool that I get to sit down and talk to his coach. So fun for me.
That's my pleasure.
So yeah, just to give people an idea of where they can continue to follow you, are there any particular like social media outlets or like a website that they can find you on?
Yeah, I have a website. It's tilburydavis.com,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just all one word. And, you know, on Instagram, Coach Tilbers, on Twitter at Tilbury Davis. I'm not prolific on social media, but certainly, you know, I do post occasionally, and certainly, you know, there's lots of background information and articles or interviews on my webpage.
Yeah, I'll be sure to link those into the show notes below. And yeah, definitely check out, for those listening, check out his website, because I believe on there you have I don't know if it's all the athletes you've worked with. I'm sure there's many more, but you list off a lot of the athletes that you've worked with over the years. And there's some pretty big names on there and some pretty cool athletes to see that you've worked with.
Yeah, I haven't got everybody on there, but the majority, or I say, a handful of athletes are on there.
Yeah. So definitely a lot of big names on there, and some pretty elite level athletes that you've worked with over the years. So you definitely have a wealth of information to share. So I'm glad I got to learn just a little bit of it.
My pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you liked what you heard in today's episode, please feel free to leave us a review. Those reviews are greatly appreciated and help spread the word about our podcast, as well as help us improve the content that we deliver to our listeners. And then finally, if you know of anyone who would be interested in listening to our podcast, please go ahead and share our podcast with them.